Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my initial review of the Canon RF 50mm f1.4L VCM, a high-end standard prime lens designed for EOS mirrorless cameras and corrected for full-frame sensors. I spent some time with an early shooting sample for this review. Announced in October 2024 and costing around £1,800, dollar price linked in description, it becomes the third native 50mm in the RF catalogue, slotting between the entry-level 51.8 STM and the super high-end 51.2L, albeit much closer to the latter in price and performance. Yep, while it's not the most expensive high-end 51.4 on the market, it's still a chunk of change, especially when Sony's 50mm 1.4 G Master can be had for around $1,300 or £1,500, while Sigma's 51.4 DGDN Art is almost half that price. Both are great quality standard prime lenses, although of course neither available in the RF mount. So back to Canon's world, where amazingly it becomes their first non-cinema 51.4 prime since the EF 51.4 USM launched back in 1993. 3 decades ago this became a hugely popular lens, again slotting between the EF 1.8 and 1.2 models, but that time much closer to the 1.8 in price and size. Now, I like the compact size and affordable positioning of the EF 51.4, but I did find that it didn't always live up to expectations in terms of quality. In contrast, the new RF 51.4 is aiming much higher, not only as a member of the L series, but also part of a growing number of hybrid lenses optimized for both photo and video. In Canon's world, a hybrid prime lens means having a declicked aperture ring, minimal focus breathing, and fast, smooth focusing, but also a unified size and design first seen with the RF 35 1.4L VCM a few months earlier. But don't worry if you're only into taking photos with it, just think of it as a high-quality 50mm 1.4 that's a substantial step up over the 1.8 without the cost and heft of the 51.2. Just as a reminder, the budget RF 51.8 STM measures 69 by 41mm, weighs just 160 grams and costs around $200 or pounds, while the high-end RF 51.2L measures 90 by 108mm, weighs a substantial 950 grams and will set you back around $2,300 or almost £2,500. Meanwhile, the new RF 51.4L falls roughly in between, measuring 77 by 99mm and weighing 575 grams, albeit again costing closer to the 1.2 at around £1,800. Again, this makes it much larger and more expensive than the old EF 51.4, but much more portable than the hefty RF 51.2. To illustrate where Canon's going with their hybrid series, here's the existing RF 35 1.4L in the middle, flanked by the new RF 50 1.4L on the right, and the equally new RF 24 1.4L on the left, which was launched alongside it. I've got a separate review on the 24 if you're interested, not to mention the new RF 70-200 2.8 zoom. So in total, this now makes 2 hybrid zooms and 3 hybrid primes launched to date. The 3 primes share the same size, design, controls and aperture, with only their labels and lens hoods to really tell them apart. Even their weights are only a few grams different. To further cement the design strategy, here's the RF 24 1.4L on an EOS R5 Mark II, now swapped for the RF 35 1.4L, and finally the RF 50 1.4L. And now with their hoods mounted, starting with the 24, followed by the 35, and now the 50. Since they all fit, be careful not to mix these hoods up. In terms of controls, the RF 51.4L is exactly the same as the 35, so starts with a permanently declicked aperture ring nearest the mount. This turns smoothly and quietly, and it's designed for discrete adjustments when filming video, or just set it to the lockable A position for traditional body-based control. But for photos, it's a thornier issue. First, unlike Sony, Sigma and now Fujifilm, there's no option to set it to clicked operation. Secondly, pre-2024 bodies won't even recognise the aperture ring when shooting photos. Now, it'll work just fine when filming video on older bodies, but the only ones that can use the ring for photos, at the time I made this review, are the R5 Mark II and the R1, although we can collectively cross our fingers for firmware updates on at least some older bodies. Now, Canon's explanation is that since the launch of EOS in the late 80s, the aperture has been controlled by a dial on the body, such as the rear wheel seen here on the R5 II. Plus, on higher-end RF lenses with a control ring, you can always assign this to barrel-based adjustment of the aperture if you prefer. You can see it here adjusting the aperture on the R5 II and with positive clicks too. but it still infuriates me the dedicated aperture ring on these hybrid lenses could end up being dormant for many owners and remain declicked regardless, but it is what it is. So, moving on, between the aperture and focusing rings are a switch for auto and manual focus, a custom button normally assigned for focus hold, and a spring-loaded switch which again lets you lock the aperture ring to A for body-based control. Alongside this is the free spinning manual focusing ring, which like most mirrorless lenses is motor assisted, but at least turns very smoothly here. And finally, the customizable clicky RF control ring at the end, which again can be assigned to aperture control if you're missing a clicky adjustment from the barrel. And at the end is a 67mm filter thread, again shared across all three hybrid primes so far, and a bayonet for the hood as seen earlier, although again beware not to mix it up with the other primes. Like all their lenses, there's a metal mount and dust and moisture resistance, including a rubber grommet. There's no optical stabilisation on this lens, so to eliminate the shakes you're going to need body-based stabilisation or a fast enough shutter. Focusing is taken care of by a combination of a nano USM and a voice coil motor, or VCM for short, with the latter allowing faster movement of larger lens elements. You can see it in action here on the R5 II, quickly refocusing for stills. If you prefer a slower focus pull, here's how it can look for video, again filmed using the R5 II. As it pulls focus, also notice the minimal breathing, and this is being achieved optically here without any digital compensation being applied. Turning to a human subject, mostly human anyway, here's how it looks tracking me across the frame with the lens still wide open at 1.4. As I move around, you can not only see the almost complete absence of focus breathing, but also the potential for background blur. The lens is ideal for close-range portraiture or presentations where you want to blur out most distractions behind you without resorting to longer focal lengths. Moving on to stills, here's my distant landscape scene, angled as always so that details run into the corners. This was taken on the R5 II with the lens open to 1.4. Now this lens was an early sample, but I'm told it is reflective of the quality that you can expect. Taking a closer look in the middle reveals very fine details right out of the gate, although closing the aperture one stop to f2 visibly improves the contrast. There's little to be gained in sharpness by closing it any further, so I'd say it's already operating at its best from f2 onwards. Returning to the f1.4 sample and heading into the far corner shows the details becoming a little bit softer, but this gradually improves as you close the aperture, and I'd say by f4 most pixel peepers should be very happy with the detail right across the frame. Moving on to portraits, here I am with the R5 II and the lens wide open again at 1.4, where there's very crisp details in the focused areas and attractive rendering in the background. As previewed in my face tracking video clips a minute ago, this lens is capable of delivering very smooth bokeh without any distracting busyness. It's a compelling combination of sharp focus details with lovely rendering in those blurred areas. For a more detailed look at bokeh and rendering, here's my close-up ornament test shot from the minimum focusing distance of the lens, which is 40 cm. With the aperture wide open, you can see well-behaved bokeh blobs, essentially bereft of outlining and textures. Like most large aperture lenses, there's some elongation towards the corners, but overall an attractive result. As I gradually close the aperture, you can see the blobs become more uniformly round across the frame, but mostly manage to avoid taking on the shape of the 11-bladed diaphragm system. There's certainly plenty of opportunity for some lovely bokeh with this lens. And until I get to spend more time with an absolute final production sample, that's all I'm going to say for now, but I am going to leave you with a few more sample images while wrapping up. The RF 50 1.4L VCM finally brings a mid-range standard prime to the RF system, and so far the quality is looking very good. Interestingly, it's not just the physical aspects that are shared with the 35 and new 24, but also a lot of their optical characteristics. This performance is, however, reflected in the high price, which, while lower than the 51.2, is still a considerable step up over the 51.8. So while it is priced between these two lenses and technically Canon's mid-range model, it's far from becoming the RF version of the old EF 51.4 which some had hoped for. It's larger, it's heavier, and it's much more expensive, although to be fair, it's also noticeably better quality. Plus, there's the annoying limitation of that aperture ring becoming redundant for photos on most bodies and lacking any clicked feedback for those that do support it. Yes, I know the ring is designed for video, but I'd have preferred to switch to click or declick it and for it to work for both photo and video on all EOS R bodies, but maybe that's just me. Ultimately though, it's going to be too expensive for many photographers looking for a mid-range standard prime, and it does illustrate how there's easily room for both it and say Sigma's DG-DN Art version if they ever enter the full-frame RF market. But equally, we're not short of other options. If you're willing to adapt an older EF lens, there's loads of models at great prices, especially on the used market. How about a Sigma 50 1.4 HSM art for around $400? Or maybe Canon's own EF 50 1.4 USM for around $200? Have a look at mpp.com for used gear, and I've got links in the description for both new and used options. Which only leaves me to ask you what you think in the comments, and to thank you for watching as always. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.